In the year 1330 BCE, if you were a freshly birthed human being along the fertile banks of the Nile, your statistical odds of reaching your fifth birthday were roughly equivalent to a coin toss. Demographers estimating the vital statistics of the New Kingdom calculate an infant mortality rate hovering between 28 and 33% within the first 12 months of life, with total child mortality surging past 50% before the onset of puberty. Subscribe. You'll want to see how this ends. This was not a tragic anomaly, but the baseline economic reality of the most advanced empire on the planet. The very lifeblood of Egyptian civilization, the annual flooding of the Nile, known as the Akhet, was simultaneously a massive biological weapon deployed against newborn immune systems. As the river spilled over its banks every July, it deposited nutrient-dense silt across the floodplains, while transforming the surrounding stagnant pools into thriving incubators for schistosoma parasitic worms, Vibrio cholerae, and an astounding variety of bacterial dysentery agents. Combined with summer temperatures routinely exceeding 105 degrees Fahrenheit in Upper Egypt, a newborn baby was essentially an unarmored bundle of calories trapped in a biohazard zone. The immediate response to this environmental minefield was recorded in documents like the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, dating to roughly 1850 BCE, and the later Ebers Papyrus, which treated human pediatrics not as an elevated science, but as a series of drastic trial-and-error interventions designed to keep a fragile biological asset from leaking to death. The survival protocol began the exact second the infant cleared the birth canal, a process handled not in sterile medical chambers, but on the exposed clay bricks of a specialized birth hut, where the mother squatted on 4 hollowed-out ceramic blocks named meskenet. The cutting of the umbilical cord was the first biological wall the infant had to clear. It was performed using a freshly fractured blade of black obsidian or chipped flint, materials chosen not for historical aesthetics, but because freshly knapped glass edges produced a cleaner cut than corrosion-prone copper tools. Once severed, the stump was routinely smeared with a dark paste made from Nile silt, river mud, and plant resins, an ancient attempt at cauterization that double-buffered as a direct invitation for Clostridium tetani spore infections. If the child survived the initial infection lottery of the umbilical dressing, it was immediately subjected to a physical inspection that reads like a modern quality assurance triage. Ancient Egyptian midwives checked the pitch and volume of the baby's first cry. A sharp, piercing sound signaled high muscular tone and viable lungs, whereas a dull, raspy whimpering was recorded as a sign that the infant was ready to face its fate, a flat, clinical euphemism for immediate palliative abandonment. The physical environment into which these viable infants were thrust was actively hostile to human physiology. The dense mud brick housing of sites like Deir el-Medina trapped ambient heat and hummed with millions of synanthropic flies, which acted as vectors for ophthalmia, a severe bacterial eye infection that blinded thousands of infants before they could walk. To counter this, Egyptian mothers relied on an aggressive regimen of topical ointments detailed in the Berlin Papyrus. Pharmacological remedies included smearing the infant's eyelids with a paste composed of crushed green malachite, galena, and human breast milk mixed with the fat of a waterfowl. Surprisingly, the malachite provided a genuine, albeit accidental, medical benefit. Copper carbonate within the mineral possesses verified broad-spectrum antibacterial properties, effectively serving as an ancient topical antibiotic against staphylococcal eye infections. However, the rest of the infant body was subjected to far less scientifically sound therapies. To protect the infant's GI tract from the fatal dehydration caused by summer diarrhea, ancient physicians prescribed concoctions containing crushed roasted barley, honey, and literal pellets of dried goat dung mixed into boiled cow's milk. The economic stakes behind these bizarre medical bets were staggering. In a hyper-agrarian society, driven entirely by manual labor, an infant was not merely an emotional addition to the household. It was a future agrarian unit, required to farm the allotted royal land plots, pay the pharaonic grain taxes, and maintain the complex canal networks that kept the kingdom from starving. Losing a child was a direct blow to the family's long-term economic solvency and pension plan for old age. Consequently, when empirical medicine failed, which was the case for nearly 1 out of every 3 births, the ancient Egyptians transitioned seamlessly from crude clinical trials to an incredibly dense, highly structured network of magical armor and defensive rituals designed to terrify the unseen biological threats into submission. When science yielded no measurable results against invisible pathogens, the Egyptian home transformed into an active magical combat zone. The primary defensive line for an infant under the age of 3 was not a physician, but a specialized class of protective amulets and physical charms anchored directly to the child's body. Chief among these was the depiction of Bes, a squat, bow-legged dwarf deity depicted with a lion's mane, exposed teeth, and an aggressively ugly grimace. The psychological logic was ruthlessly pragmatic. The Egyptians reasoned that demonic forces, bad air, and ambient disease vectors were easily startled, meaning an amulet so grotesque that it shocked the viewer would successfully ward off invisible spirits seeking to steal an infant's breath in the night. Mothers tied small carved ivory or faience Bes figures around the neck, ankles, and wrists of their babies using cords spun from flax or human hair. For newborn infants who were entirely helpless, parents utilized magical wands, curved, flat instruments carved from the dense ivory of hippopotamus tusks, decorated with aggressively armed protective figures holding snakes, knives, and frogs. Midwives drew physical circles in the dirt floor surrounding the birth brick, using these ivory tusks, chanting specific incantations meant to convert the sleeping area into a literal fortress against the Maut, the restless dead believed to wander human settlements at night, seeking to inhabit or consume the warm bodies of living infants. The physical evidence for this superstitious desperation is staggering. Archaeological digs at domestic sites like Kahun have unearthed hundreds of these ivory wands, many worn down at the tip from repeatedly being scraped against dusty floors during nocturnal protective rituals. Yet, beneath this dense layer of apotropaic magic lay an intensely practical biological strategy that ultimately did more heavy lifting for infant survival rates than any mineral paste or ivory wand: prolonged, uninterrupted lactation. Egyptian mothers, supported by social custom and formal legal contracts preserved from later periods, routinely breastfed their children for 3 full years. In an environment where every drop of surface water was thoroughly contaminated with intestinal parasites, mother's milk was the only sterile, pathogen-free fluid available to a developing child. More importantly, this extended 3-year nursing period provided a continuous, daily passive transfer of maternal immunoglobulins, specifically IgA antibodies, protecting the infant's vulnerable gut lining against the lethal strains of local bacteria. This biological reality was so well understood that wet nursing emerged as a lucrative, heavily regulated industry for those who could afford it. Wealthy elite families and royal households hired professional wet nurses who were bound by strict legal contracts demanding high-protein diets and absolute physical isolation from diseased populations to protect the milk quality. To ensure the nurses' milk supply remained robust, Egyptian medical papyri prescribed topical treatments made of rubbed poppy seeds and boiled lotus petals rubbed directly onto the breasts, alongside complex liquid drafts brewed from sweet beer and roasted fenugreek. This 3-year lactation window was so biologically vital that it effectively functioned as a natural demographic governor. While a woman was actively nursing, lactation amenorrhea significantly lowered her chances of immediate secondary pregnancy, spacing out births and allowing families to focus their limited nutritional resources on keeping one fragile child alive before rolling the dice on the next biological gamble. This 3-year biological buffer provided a narrow survival window, but extended lactation could not shield a child from the inevitable, terrifying moment of weaning. Transitioning an infant from sterile maternal milk to solid food and local water was effectively handing them a biological death sentence, exposing their naive immune systems to a devastating barrage of gastrointestinal pathogens. To navigate this perilous transition, Egyptian households relied on crude weaning formulas that were equal parts nutritional patch and microbiological roulette. Papyri from the New Kingdom detail recipes combining boiled cow or goat milk with pulverized roasted barley, crushed dates, and wild lotus flower, boiled down into a dense, starchy porridge. Because ceramic spoons and refined feeding bottles were non-existent for the average agrarian peasant, these concoctions were funneled into infants using hollowed-out cow horns or porous, unglazed earthenware vessels shaped like miniature animals or breasts. Archaeological excavations across the Nile Delta have revealed that these tiny ceramic vessels were porous breeding grounds for lethal bacterial colonies. Tests on organic residues scraped from the interior walls of unearthed feeding cups found dense concentrations of lipid fats mixed with deadly strains of Enterobacteriaceae and Staphylococcus, proving that the very tools designed to nourish children were routinely poisoning them. When severe bacterial gastroenteritis inevitably struck, causing rapid dehydration through rampant diarrhea, ancient Egyptian physicians had no conceptual understanding of fluid replacement or electrolyte balances. Instead, their medical papyri prescribed aggressively toxic concoctions intended to purge the body of bad air or corrupted fluids. The Berlin Medical Papyrus, dating to roughly 1350 BCE, contains specific pediatric prescriptions for stopping infantile diarrhea that sound like a dark recipe for severe poisoning. A blend of finely crushed green jasper, dried fly droppings collected from wall corners, and boiled sweet beer, administered 3 times daily. The logic behind including insect waste was rooted in sympathetic magic and empirical observation. Flies thrived around decaying organic matter without perishing, leading ancient healers to assume their waste possessed potent, defensive magic against systemic decay. Remarkably, while fly droppings introduced additional pathogens, other ingredients in the medical repertoire possessed real, albeit accidental, pharmacological efficacy. Eye infections, particularly trachoma, a bacterial disease caused by Chlamydia trachomatis that was swept across mud-brick villages by desert winds and swarms of black flies, were treated with heavy applications of malachite, a green copper carbonate mineral ground into a fine paste with animal fat. Modern biochemistry confirms that copper ions possess immense, broad-spectrum antimicrobial properties, effectively sterilizing bacterial colonies on contact. Egyptian parents who lined their infants' eyelids with dark malachite or galena coal were not just engaging in cosmetic or ritualistic decoration, they were unwittingly applying a crude, highly effective topical antibiotic shield that saved hundreds of thousands of children from permanent blindness and secondary cranial infections. Yet, no medical intervention could fully compensate for the structural, economic, and political pressures that made infant life so cheap in the eyes of the state. In the strictly stratified society of the New Kingdom, every human body was an economic asset, a future tax unit evaluated entirely on its capacity to perform hard physical labor. The pharaonic state required a massive, continuous influx of agricultural workers to sow and harvest the royal grain fields, build massive stone monuments, and maintain the complex network of irrigation canals that prevented the kingdom from collapsing into famine. Because the state extracted up to 30% of an agrarian family's annual grain harvest in taxes, peasant households operated on razor-thin economic margins, where a non-productive child was a massive financial drain. If an infant suffered from congenital deformities, severe birth trauma, or chronic developmental delays that rendered them unlikely to contribute to physical labor, the reality was bleak. While explicit, state-sanctioned infanticide was far less common in Egypt than in ancient Greece or Rome, Passive exposure and deliberate neglect were widely practiced covert survival strategies among impoverished rural families. Historical tax rolls and village censuses from sites like Deir el-Medina reveal a telling demographic anomaly. Reported male infant survival rates consistently outpaced female rates during periods of regional drought or low Nile flooding, indicating that households actively prioritized male infants who possessed higher physical labor potential when food allocations grew scarce. For those infants who did survive the perilous first 3 years, their transition into functional economic units was swift and absolute. There was no prolonged, romanticized concept of childhood in the ancient Nile Valley. By age 4 or 5, children were fitted with miniature linen loincloths or kept entirely naked to conserve costly textiles, and immediately put to work. They were assigned simple, high-volume tasks, scaring birds away from ripening barley crops, collecting dry livestock dung to be pressed into fuel bricks for cooking fires, and fetching water from contaminated irrigation ditches in heavy clay jars. The physical toll of this immediate labor is permanently etched into the skeletal remains of ancient working-class Egyptians. Anthropological studies conducted on hundreds of peasant skeletons buried in common graves at Amarna reveal severe spinal compression, premature osteoarthritis in the knees and ankles, and bone lesions consistent with carrying immense, heavy loads long before their growth plates had fused. By the time an Egyptian child reached their 10th year, having beaten the 50% demographic odds of early death, their body already bore the physical signatures of a lifetime of grueling manual labor. The ultimate irony of ancient Egyptian infant survival lies in the radical contradiction between their domestic reality and their immortal aspirations. The very civilization that dedicated vast economic fortunes, complex engineering, and generations of labor to building indestructible stone tombs and embalming royal corpses to achieve eternal life was fundamentally incapable of protecting its own newborn children from a cup of contaminated water or a bite from a common housefly. Parents buried their dead babies in simple, unadorned clay jars placed beneath the dirt floors of their mud brick kitchens, keeping their lost children physically close to the domestic hearth while desperately painting protective magic symbols on the outside of the terracotta vessels. They poured their hope into ivory wands, copper eye pastes, and 3 long years of mother's milk, operating at the absolute limits of their empirical knowledge and biological capability to keep a fragile life flickering in a hostile desert world. Out of this desperate, perpetual war against an unseen microbiological enemy emerged a society obsessed with life, continuity, and rebirth, not because they held power over death, but because they were completely helpless against the silent, relentless slaughter of their youngest children.